The sun rose slowly over the jagged ridges of Sinaloa's Sierra Madre Mountains, spilling light across the tiny village of La Tuna. It was a place forgotten by time. No paved roads, no electricity, just endless stretches of rocky soil and the quiet echo of survival. Here, in this rugged silence, Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera opened his eyes to a world that offered him nothing. And yet somehow, he would learn to take everything. He was just a boy then, barefoot, dusty, chasing goats through the hills, unaware that one day those same hills would whisper his name like a legend. People would call him El Chapo, the short one. But back then, he was simply Joaquin, a boy who dreamed of more than the hand life had dealt him. His father, Emilio, was a farmer hardened by sun and struggle. His mother, Maria, was the quiet backbone of the family, a woman who believed in prayer even when food was scarce. Their home was built from mud bricks and patched metal, and they didn't own much: a few hens, a mule, and a stubborn will to survive. From his earliest days, Joaquin learned that life in La Tuna was a trade of effort for endurance. The soil was dry, the land unforgiving. When crops failed, people bartered, borrowed, or broke the rules. Here, in these mountains, laws were distant things, spoken in cities, but ignored in the hills. Every morning, he helped his father plant seeds. By afternoon, he sold oranges on the dusty path to the nearest town. He'd often sit under the burning sky and wonder what lay beyond the mountains. He had left school in the 3rd grade, but his mind was sharper than any textbook could teach. He listened, observed, and calculated. He saw patterns. In people, in weather, in chance. There was something about him that others couldn't explain. Even as a child, Joaquin had a quiet focus that made people listen. When problems came, he didn't panic. He planned. When money was short, he found ways to make it stretch. Life, he realized early on, wasn't about fairness. It was about strategy. One evening, he heard his father curse the land. "It gives nothing," Emilio said, his face a map of frustration. Joaquin didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, where the sun melted behind the peaks. A quiet, dangerous thought took root in him. Maybe the land gives nothing because it's not meant to. Maybe something else is. The Sierra Madre wasn't just poor, it was secretive. Hidden among its folds were fields not of corn or beans, but of something far more profitable. As a boy, Joaquin had seen them once. Fields with strange flowers that his father never talked about. Men came and went from those places with sacks heavier than wheat and faces that spoke of risk and reward. He noticed how those men wore boots instead of sandals, drove trucks instead of mules, and how their children never went hungry. It planted a question in his young mind. What if the way out of poverty was already here, buried in these mountains? But for now, poverty kept him grounded. There were nights when rain dripped through the roof, and he and his siblings huddled together for warmth. On those nights, his mother would whisper stories of endurance. "One day, mijo," she'd say softly, "you will build something better. But don't let the world turn your heart to stone." He listened, but as he grew, he saw that kindness alone couldn't fill empty plates. By his teens, Joaquin had turned necessity into invention. He started selling fruit and small goods in nearby villages. He learned to bargain, to speak to people's needs, and to read faces. If someone said they had no money, he offered credit. Not out of kindness, but because he knew they'd come back. He was building trust, the first tool of power. That small business made him known. People said, "El hijo de Consuelo," the one with the sharp eyes, he always finds a way. It was a compliment, but also a warning. In the mountains, too much ambition could attract the wrong kind of attention. Still, Joaquin wanted more than small coins and the respect of farmers. He wanted control. The kind that came not from owning land, but from understanding people. He once told a friend, "You can lose money, you can lose crops, but if you know how people think, you can build everything again." That friend didn't fully grasp it then, but years later those words would echo across continents. Formal education ended early for Joaquin, but life became his classroom. He learned mathematics by counting profits, geography by tracing trade routes, and psychology by watching fear and greed move people like chess pieces. The older men of the hills, those who handled the secret trades, began to notice him. His discipline, his silence, his precision. They invited him for small errands, deliveries, messages, coordination. Through them, he discovered the machinery of a shadow economy, a network of loyalty, profit, and silence that ran deeper than any law. Every story has a turning point. For Joaquin, it came when he realized the world outside Sinaloa was built on connections, and he could make them. By his early 20s, he left La Tuna for Culiacan, the state capital. He arrived with no education and no family name, but with one weapon others lacked: the ability to see opportunity where others saw walls. He started working for local traffickers, managing transportation routes. It was here that people began calling him El Chapo, the short one. At first, it was a joke, but soon, it became a symbol of a man who, though small in height, towered in cunning. Every deal he made, every risk he took, was a move toward one goal: control over his own destiny. He studied how powerful men operated, how they built networks and maintained loyalty not just through fear, but through reward. He wasn't yet the king of the mountains, but he was learning how to become one. Culiacan became his testing ground. He moved with quiet determination, never loud, never reckless. People underestimated him, and he preferred it that way. "If they think you're small," he once said, "they won't see how high you're climbing." He began organizing transportation systems that moved goods across regions with stunning precision. Each route was a puzzle of terrain, timing, and trust. He solved them all, one by one. Soon, his efficiency caught the attention of bigger names in the underworld. They saw in him something rare, a man who didn't just follow orders, he improved them. And so, Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, began his quiet rise. He wasn't yet rich. He wasn't yet feared. But he had entered a world that would one day make his name echo from the jungles of Central America to the skyscrapers of New York. He never forgot his roots. He often sent money back to his mother, built houses for the poor in his village, and kept his family's name clean. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a Robin Hood of the hills. The truth lay somewhere in between, a mix of survival, ambition, and a strange code of loyalty. At night, he would look out toward the dark outline of the mountains, his home, and think about how far he'd come. Yet, deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The world was larger than Sinaloa. The game was bigger than he could imagine, and the storm that would make him a legend was gathering, quietly, invisibly, but surely. As dawn broke once more, the light crept over the same ridges that had framed his childhood. But this time, it illuminated a man who had already begun rewriting the rules of power. One silent move at a time. In the quiet hum of Culiacan's night air, a name was beginning to travel in whispers, not shouts. Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera, El Chapo. There were no headlines, no spotlights, just a growing murmur about a man who, despite his short stature, cast a long shadow. He was a student of the streets, a quiet observer in a world of noise. In those early days, El Chapo wasn't a leader. He was a learner. He watched everything. How goods moved, how people spoke, how silence often carried more weight than words. He saw patterns others missed. Trucks arriving just a little too early, people meeting one too many times, routes that looked ordinary but were anything but. He didn't just memorize the rules of the game, he decoded its hidden language. It was as if he could see the invisible blueprint of how the world truly operated. While others saw risk, El Chapo saw timing. He once quietly told a friend, "Success isn't about what you move. It's about how you move it." This simple idea would one day transform him from an unknown worker into the architect of one of the most complex networks the world had ever seen. By the late 1980s, the world of trade was in chaos. Laws were tightening, familiar routes were closing, and trust was a currency in freefall. But where others panicked, El Chapo saw an opportunity to create order. He meticulously drew maps by hand, marking deserts, rivers, and borders not as obstacles, but as a canvas for a new design. He treated movement like mathematics, and he knew that math was power. He built systems from the ground up: teams, schedules, secret communication codes, running his operation with the precision of a multinational corporation. Each person had one specific job. Each route had one purpose. Every single move had a reason. He wasn't just surviving the chaos, he was engineering a new system right in the middle of it. When borders became harder to cross, El Chapo didn't complain. He innovated. He studied topography, reading maps like novels, and began to imagine pathways that existed beneath the surface of the earth. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If you can't go over or around, go under. He consulted with miners, engineers, and architects, turning impossible geography into a secret web of invisible pathways. These weren't just crude tunnels. They were feats of engineering, built with meticulous planning, precision, and in absolute silence. When the system worked flawlessly, his team started calling him El Ingeniero, the engineer. He would just smile and say, "A good idea doesn't need to be loud, it only needs to work." While others ruled through fear and pressure, El Chapo led through presence. He had a rare habit in his world. He listened. He remembered names, families, and small details that most leaders would forget. When people worked for him, they didn't just feel like employees, they felt like respected partners in a shared venture. He rewarded effort, valued loyalty, and treated commitment as the ultimate currency. His philosophy was straightforward. If you make people feel safe, they'll never need to hide from you. Through this approach, he built a network bound not by fear, but by a deep-seated trust. People didn't follow El Chapo because they had to. They followed him because they wanted to. By 1989, the old order of the trade world began to crumble. Powerful figures vanished, leaving a landscape of fragmented territories. Where others saw only uncertainty and a power vacuum, El Chapo saw the scattered pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Quietly and logically, he began to unite these fragments under a single, powerful principle: efficiency over ego. Alongside a few trusted allies, he created what would become known as the Sinaloa Organization. But this was no ordinary gang. It was a sophisticated operation, managed with spreadsheets, encrypted messages, and layered communication systems. Each region functioned like an independent branch of a company, discreet, fast, and self-sustaining. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. But to insiders, it ran like clockwork. The genius of El Chapo's creation was its deceptive simplicity. He didn't rely on flashy technology alone. He relied on old-fashioned discipline. No single person ever knew the full plan. No document revealed the entire picture. Only he held all the pieces, seeing the complete puzzle in his mind. It was like conducting a symphony in total darkness. Yet every note landed perfectly. Authorities would later describe it as a ghost network built with the precision of a corporation, unable to trace where one connection ended and another began. It wasn't magic. It was masterful management. Every mistake became a lesson. Every success was quietly analyzed and refined for the next operation. El Chapo lived by one simple rule: never be the loudest person in the room. He believed that the more someone talked, the less control they actually had. So he stayed quiet. He listened. In high-stakes meetings, he would rarely interrupt, just nod and absorb everything. After a long pause, he would offer a single, precise suggestion that would pivot the entire conversation. His calmness was his weapon. His patience was his shield. Those who met him described a man who was soft-spoken yet magnetic, capable of diffusing a tense standoff with a single, carefully chosen line. This subtle power made him not only respected, but dangerously unpredictable. Despite his growing influence, El Chapo actively avoided fame. He disliked cameras, shunned luxury, and preferred simple, unassuming clothes. He wasn't interested in building a legend. He was building longevity. He moved like a ghost between mountains and cities, constantly adapting and adjusting. He didn't want to be the face of the operation. He wanted to be the mind behind it. It's said that at the height of his power, many who worked for him couldn't even be sure what he looked like. His power wasn't in being seen. It was in being felt everywhere. Occasionally, he would return to La Tuna, the small mountain village where his story began. There, he wasn't a kingpin. He was just Joaquin. He'd visit his mother, talk to the local children, help fund repairs for roads, and support small businesses. For him, La Tuna wasn't a hideout. It was home. He walked the same dusty paths he once did as a boy selling oranges. But now, each step carried the immense weight of the empire he had built, not with brute force, but with extraordinary vision. He often told the locals, "Never forget where you started. That's the only map that never changes." By the mid-1990s, his operation had gone global, connecting cities, ports, and markets across continents with astonishing precision. He had created a system that moved like the shadow of a clock, silent, predictable, and seemingly unstoppable. But with great success comes great scrutiny. Governments finally started to notice. The whispers turned into major investigations. The Invisible Man was suddenly on the world's most wanted list. Yet, El Chapo didn't panic. He adjusted. He began designing backup networks, more secure communication layers, and forging new alliances that made his empire almost impossible to fully dismantle. Where others saw danger, he saw the next stage of evolution. Standing one night before a map covered in lines and routes, El Chapo allowed himself a faint smile. To anyone else, it was just a chart. To him, it was a masterpiece. Proof that vision and discipline could bend destiny itself. He gently touched a line that stretched from his remote hometown to a distant foreign city and whispered, "Every mountain has a way out. You just need to dig in the right direction." In that moment, he wasn't just talking about tunnels or trade. He was talking about life. The man from the mountains had become something more, a legend in the making, and the world was only just beginning to learn his name. Years later, long after his name had become a whisper that traveled faster than headlines, a different kind of silence surrounded Joaquin Guzman. Not the silence of mountains or open land. This was the silence of concrete, steel, and controlled air. The silence of a world built to stop motion, stop freedom, stop a legend. He was inside a maximum security facility, not as a myth, not as an echo, but as a controlled presence, sealed behind walls designed to erase momentum. The world outside had changed. Governments now spoke his name openly. Agencies studied his methods like engineers reading blueprints. He was no longer invisible. He was contained. At least, that's what they believed. From the moment he entered the institution, nothing in his posture suggested defeat. He walked like a man boarding a delayed flight, inconvenienced, not ended. His eyes adjusted not to captivity, but to routine. And he treated routine the way a mathematician treats numbers, a code waiting to be solved. Prisons are built for bodies, not for minds. And El Chapo's greatest weapon had never been force. It was pattern recognition. He began learning the rhythm of the lights, the timing of the guard's steps, the turnover of the staff, the smallest lag in protocol. He did this not with urgency, but with immense patience. To him, a prison wasn't an end, it was a system. And every system is readable. He never spoke about plans. He never asked questions that revealed his intent. He listened more than he answered, observed more than he interacted. To everyone around him, he appeared adjusted, resigned, compliant. But compliance is often the most misunderstood form of control. Meanwhile, outside, the empire he had built wasn't collapsing. It was adapting, quietly. He hadn't designed a network that depended on his hands. He had designed one that ran on structure, not personality. He didn't need to send orders. He had already built algorithms in human form. Lieutenants trained not to wait for words, but to follow frameworks. The organization didn't pause because he was gone. It accelerated because he had planned for his own absence. This is what separated him from those before him. Others ran empires. He built empires that could run without the emperor. Back inside the controlled space, he continued to catalog what others ignored. He watched which guards were punctual and which ones broke routine. Who checked a lock twice and who only checked it once. Which corridors echoed and which absorbed sound. Which cameras were angled for maximum coverage and which ones left micro-blind spots. He didn't see bricks and bars. He saw variables. Some men in confinement try to escape boredom. He used boredom as a microscope. There's a common misconception that a man is powerless without his territory. But real power isn't about land. It's about interpretation. Where another prisoner might see a sealed door, he saw a schedule. Where another heard approaching footsteps, he heard inconsistency. Where another felt trapped, he felt time accumulating like stored energy. He adjusted his own heartbeat to the environment, matching its tempo instead of resisting it. That is why he remained centered while others panicked. He didn't fight the system, he absorbed it, layer by layer. Every institution believes itself to be flawless until it's studied by someone who treats perfection as a hypothesis, not a fact. He noticed one universal truth. People grow comfortable with systems they repeat daily. And comfort creates micro-errors. A shortcut in paperwork, a signature done without review, a door closed but not fully verified, a routine performed automatically instead of consciously. He didn't need a forceful opening. He needed a pattern-based opening. One that would appear completely natural to everyone except the one designing it. As the months turned into years, his name outside faded from headlines into habit. The world assumed his story was over. Governments marked his case as contained, and that very assumption became their greatest vulnerability. He had something the system never expected him to have: time with no distractions. And time is a dangerous advantage when given to someone who knows how to convert it into a design. While others waited for release dates, he was calculating the breakpoints of predictability. There is always a moment, invisible to observers, when a prisoner stops being processed by the environment and begins processing the environment instead. That shift happened for him in complete silence. He never announced his resolve. He never adjusted his tone. He never signaled a change in his posture. From the outside, he remained a model of compliance. But from the inside, he began reversing the direction of control, studying the system just as intently as the system had studied him. He once observed to himself, not aloud, never aloud: a wall is only a wall to someone who accepts it as a boundary. Outside those walls, his network continued to move with strange accuracy, as if anticipating a future where he might not stay confined. Not because they were actively planning a break for him, but because they were following a doctrine he had written years before. Continuity creates certainty. Certainty creates stability. Stability survives absence. He didn't need to direct them from inside. He had already trained them to operate in a state of pre-engineered continuity. That's why markets didn't collapse, why alliances didn't fracture, and why trust didn't erode after his capture. The empire ran on design, not on his presence. The world misread that as luck. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, conditions began to align. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through a convergence of all the weaknesses he had observed. A prison is a machine. Every machine has maintenance cycles, and every cycle creates a momentary misalignment. He didn't need a dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He just needed a predictable one. And predictability is the easiest thing to find in a repetitive environment. Years inside had trained him to tolerate delay the way a pilot tolerates turbulence. He understood that timing matters far more than speed. He wasn't waiting to break the system. He was waiting for the system to complete its own sequence. A sequence he had already mapped out in silence. The outside world thought of him as contained. He thought of himself as stored. And storage is not defeat. Storage is simply a pause before deployment. Then came a night, unremarkable to everyone except the one who had been waiting for it. A night when the pattern he had studied for years finally aligned with the margin for error he had calculated. There were no alarms, no confrontation, no visible disruption, just the quiet collision of timing, predictability, and prepared intent. It wasn't an explosion of action. It was the execution of an inevitability. What followed was not chaos. It was choreography. Not speed, but precision. It wasn't a product of chance, but of preparation meeting timing with mathematical discipline. There was no trace of resistance, no signal of disorder, nothing to indicate force had been used. Only absence. An absence that no one expected, because no one believed such an absence was even possible. By the time the system realized the variable had changed, he was already outside its logic. The world had to reset. There was no noisy return, no grand announcement. There was only a silent shift in the air. Maps mattered again. Markets recalibrated. Files that had been gathering dust were reopened. Agencies that had archived his name under resolved scrambled to reopen their task forces. He had returned not with a spectacle, but with the most powerful form of proof. A demonstration that his containment had been an illusion all along. He did not reappear in public. He did not broadcast his presence. He moved the same way he built his empire, without being seen. Everyone knew he was out, but no one knew from where he would begin again. And that uncertainty was his true re-entry into the world. He hadn't merely escaped a structure. He had reclaimed his narrative asymmetry. He entered the prison as a man the world believed it had finally understood. He left it as a theorem, proven against the very system that tried to contain him. And once again, as before, as always, he did it without making a sound. When a man like Joaquin Guzman vanishes from state custody, you might expect a spectacle, sirens, headlines, a dramatic chase. But that's not what happened. The night he stepped back into freedom, the world didn't erupt. It held its breath. The story wasn't over. A new, quieter, and far more unsettling chapter had just begun. Governments, intelligence agencies, rival networks, everyone who thought they had him figured out, were forced to recalibrate. There were no press conferences, no bold declarations, just a deafening silence. But in that silence, a powerful signal was sent. The file that had been marked closed was ripped back open. Every rumor, every whispered sighting sent ripples of tension across the globe. He was no longer a figure from the past. He was a variable in the present, a ghost in the machine. The media was the first to sense the shift. The public's imagination, which had been lulled into a sense of security, suddenly reignited with a mix of fear and fascination. Headlines that had spoken of him in the past tense suddenly switched to the present. He wasn't history. He was a developing story. News outlets, desperate for any piece of information, amplified every unverified tip. The world became hyper-aware, searching for clues in the shadows. He had mastered the art of operating in a vacuum of certainty, and he was now using the world's own speculation against it. Behind closed doors, from Washington, D.C. to Mexico City, intelligence analysts scrambled. They mapped his old networks, dissected his past moves, and tried to predict his next step. They were prepared for a show of force, for a direct challenge. But how do you fight a ghost? How do you counter an opponent who makes no observable moves, who leaves no signature? The chilling realization began to sink in. They had never truly understood the nature of his power. He wasn't just reacting. He was anticipating, orchestrating, and pulling strings from the shadows. The invisible hand had returned to the board. And what about his own organization? There was no sudden call to arms, no grand meeting. His network activated with a quiet, almost imperceptible efficiency. It was like a dormant system coming back online, each part knowing its role without needing a direct command. Communications flowed like an underground river, unseen but powerful. The lack of noise was the message itself. The architect was back, and the machine was running perfectly. While the world saw chaos and disruption, what was really happening was a masterclass in stealth and control. This created immense psychological pressure. How do you defend against an enemy you can't see? His rivals, the authorities, even his allies were forced to guess his intentions. Uncertainty became his greatest weapon. He knew that what people imagine in the dark is often far more terrifying than any real threat. In boardrooms and war rooms, the stress wasn't from what he was doing, but from what he could be doing. Every potential move he had ever designed was now a silent threat, hanging in the air. He didn't rush to reclaim his throne. Instead, he watched. He evaluated. He waited for the perfect moment. Old alliances were tested with subtle gestures. Loyalties were measured. Every action was layered with contingencies, designed to reveal nothing. By the time the world even started to grasp the scale of his comeback, the foundations of his new empire were already firmly in place. What looked like a sudden resurgence was actually the result of months of patient, meticulous orchestration. Of course, the authorities didn't just sit back. Operations were launched. International partnerships were strengthened. But government agencies have rules, protocols, and borders. He exploited these very limitations, not by breaking the law, but by moving in the spaces between them, indirectly, legally, and invisibly. Public speculation only fueled the fire. Rumors on social media and in the news painted a picture of an omnipresent figure, a ghost who was everywhere at once. In a way, his own legend became a tool, sharpened by his absence and wielded with perfect timing. His core strategy was simple: remain unseen, yet be undeniably effective. Every signal was measured, every move calculated to create more ambiguity. By staying in the shadows, he forced everyone else to act first, to show their hand. He turned the world's response into a predictable system, one he could easily navigate. Rival networks hesitated, unsure how to react. They were playing checkers while he was playing three-dimensional chess, orchestrating their moves without ever making one himself. Global agencies watched, but they were always one step behind, lost in a fog of misinformation. Every checkpoint, every piece of surveillance was met with misdirection and redundancy. He had anticipated their procedures, and in doing so, made their actions predictable. He was free, yet hidden, present, yet invisible, a paradox that demonstrated his complete control over the situation. As the months went on, the pattern became undeniable. His influence grew, his networks solidified, and his power was re-established, all without a single public appearance. Observers saw the effects, but they couldn't pinpoint the cause. This was his second reign, defined not by violence and confrontation, but by precision, perception, and patience. He had tricked the world into reacting to his every whim before he even needed to act. And so, the ultimate realization dawned on everyone watching. True power doesn't need to be seen. Influence can be wielded from the shadows. By returning silently, by letting perception and timing do the heavy lifting, he shaped events without ever stepping into the light. The man who had been a prisoner was now the invisible force by which everyone else measured their next move. He had turned his own absence into a strategy, and his silence into a declaration of absolute authority. The world had braced for his actions, but it never anticipated his method. They watched, they guessed, and they moved, all according to his design. A quiet storm was sweeping the globe, driven not by force, but by a masterful plan. The man they thought they had contained had reclaimed his invisible throne, teaching the world a timeless lesson. The greatest power is the ability to shape reality without ever being seen. Years had passed since Joaquin Guzman reclaimed his freedom. Yet his influence resonated far beyond prison walls, across borders, industries, and into the very fabric of global networks. What made his story remarkable wasn't the noise of his infamous deeds, but the quiet, relentless persistence of his designs. He didn't seek spectacle, he sought endurance. Legacy isn't built in a day, nor is it forged through mere notoriety. It's a structure of influence that survives absence, scrutiny, and the passage of time. Guzman understood this. His empire was never dependent solely on his presence. It was embedded in systems, networks, and human capital he had meticulously cultivated over decades. Each associate, each operational protocol, each line of communication was designed to function on its own, yet as part of a cohesive whole. The organization became self-sustaining, resilient, and subtly responsive to his guidance, even from afar. The genius of his legacy lay in its invisibility. He didn't need to assert himself publicly. His presence was felt through actions, responses, and consequences. Decisions he'd made years prior continued to ripple through the networks he built, as if guided by an unseen hand. In this way, legacy wasn't just about survival. It was about perpetuation, without overt control. Though Guzman remained largely unseen, the world took note. Governments monitored, journalists speculated, and rivals recalibrated. The legend had outgrown the man, becoming a principle, a reminder that true influence can exist beyond immediate perception. Analysts studying his patterns discovered that the most effective power is often the one that operates silently, undetected, yet with profound consequences. The subtle recalibration of alliances, the anticipation of political maneuvers, the seamless coordination of logistics. All of these reinforced a presence that could never be fully measured. His story became a reference point for scholars and strategists. Case studies in law enforcement and organizational behavior cited his ability to shape events without ever being in the room. He became a living example of a paradoxical truth. Control doesn't need to be exercised openly to be absolute. Every empire faces the inevitability of succession. Guzman had learned from the failures of those who came before him, who understood that relying on a single, central authority creates a fragile system. So, he invested in developing successors capable of autonomous operation. They were trained to make decisions within pre-established frameworks and adhere to the core philosophy of discretion. These individuals weren't just replacements, they were extensions of a vision, trained to act in harmony with his protocols while interpreting nuances that no rigid system could account for. Succession wasn't just about his personal legacy, it was the guarantee of the organization's endurance. By fostering leadership that could adapt without constant oversight, Guzman ensured that the empire he built could withstand the inevitable uncertainties of time, scrutiny, and opposition. A critical component of his influence was the manipulation of perception. The world interpreted his actions according to narratives that he had indirectly shaped. Silence, absence, and unpredictability became tools of strategic advantage. When the media speculated, when authorities overextended, when rivals hesitated, these reactions were often the preordained consequences of his long-term designs. In every instance, his choices, or even his lack of choices, were calibrated to leverage human psychology. He demonstrated that the most profound forms of power are often the invisible ones. By controlling how the world saw him, Guzman exerted an influence far greater than any physical presence could ever achieve. He had transformed legacy from a passive memory into an active living force. Governments and international agencies that once pursued him relentlessly began to adapt their own strategies based on the lessons of his operations. Analysts noted the effectiveness of his networked autonomy, his system's redundancy, and his incredible anticipatory planning. Guzman's methods became case studies, not in criminality, but in pure strategy, resilience, and organizational design. The very structures that had been tools of his empire now informed the tactics of global institutions, albeit applied in entirely different contexts. This ironic twist only reinforced his reputation. The influence he exerted didn't require confrontation or spectacle. His legacy was a blueprint, observed, analyzed, and often emulated, proving that the quietest strategies can be the most enduring. Beyond the operational sphere, Guzman's story permeated our culture. Films, documentaries, and books explored his ability to navigate complexity, adapt to adversity, and wield influence without relying on brute force. While many condemned the origins of his empire, few could deny the intellectual rigor of his strategies. In effect, he became an archetype of calculated resilience, a cautionary tale, a study in human ingenuity, and a narrative about the interplay of presence, perception, and power. The lessons extended far beyond the networks he once controlled. They resonated with anyone seeking to understand how influence, authority, and strategy operate in environments defined by uncertainty and opposition. Central to Guzman's enduring impact was his core philosophy. Power isn't about exertion, but about orchestration. By embedding authority into the structure itself, by anticipating reactions, and by shaping perception, he demonstrated that true influence could be both silent and absolute. For him, time became an ally, not an adversary. Patience became a tool as sharp as any weapon. And his absence, paradoxically, became a form of omnipresence. His approach underscored a universal principle. Systems outlive individuals, but individuals who design those systems can achieve a form of immortality through their structures. By the end of his arc, Guzman's name had transcended mere notoriety. He wasn't just remembered for the empires he built or the escapes he orchestrated. He was remembered for the intellectual architecture of his operations, for demonstrating that influence doesn't require visibility, and for leaving behind a framework that could outlast any single person. Even those who opposed him had to acknowledge the sophistication of his design. His operations, when studied, revealed layers of contingency, foresight, and subtlety that were nearly unparalleled. In essence, the empire he created became a living lesson in strategy, psychology, and organizational mastery. Guzman's final act was perhaps the most symbolic of his entire life. He ensured that his influence would persist in shadows, not in the light. He never sought accolades or visibility. He cultivated endurance, systemic stability, and the capacity for his organization to adapt on its own. His successors, his networks, and even his observers were bound to operate within the frameworks he had designed, ensuring continuity far beyond his personal presence. In doing so, he redefined what legacy means. It was no longer tied to a biography or a headline, but to the long-term quiet efficacy of invisible influence. As historians and analysts would later observe, Joaquin Guzman's life can be summarized not by the loud events, but by his subtle mastery of control, perception, and endurance. The quiet orchestration of influence, the anticipation of human behavior, and the embedding of autonomy into his structures made him a figure whose impact extended far beyond his own actions. He became, in every sense, a study of power without spectacle, a reminder that a true legacy is measured not by the noise one makes, but by the quiet persistence of the effects one leaves behind.
The case may be closed, but Crimology never sleeps. Like and subscribe join Crimology, and step deeper into the dark with us.